Hi, everyone. Welcome to Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I've spent over 30 years in healthcare sales, from building lasting partnerships to driving real results for hospitals and health systems. And I'm here to share what I've learned about leading with service and how that can change the game for you no matter where you are in your career. So last week, I made the case that what executives really need from you isn't more information, it's context. And that those two things, they are not the same, right? Information is a 30-page deck. Context is you showing an executive something true about their own business that they didn't already see. And I left you with one question to carry into every single deal. Instead of asking, how many people do I need to convince? You ask, what does the decision maker need to feel confident? So today I want to get really practical because it's one thing for me to say, go build context, right? It's a whole other thing to actually know how to do it. So I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps of context selling, exactly what an executive needs from you to feel confident enough to make the call. So the first step is to pay close attention to when executives lean in. And in my experience, that kind of happens in 3 situations. It's when you know their market, when you understand their pressures, and when you bring them a point of view they haven't heard before. Because here's the thing, C-suite executives, they are not looking for you to educate them about their own business, right? What they want is for you to understand their industry deeply enough to see patterns they can't see from the inside. They want you to bring external context and data and frontline experience that their own teams just don't have access to. And when you show up with that, decisions actually move. And I've seen this in my own selling and in the work I do with clients, like the executives who seemed impossible to close, they had really straightforward conversations once the right context was finally in the room, and nothing changed about the product, right? Nothing changed about the price. The conversation just, it finally matched the level at which they actually think and decide. Step 2 is to share specific relevant details. And there's this really persistent myth out there that executives only want the executive summary, like keep it short, lead with the headline, don't get into the weeds. And I've found the complete opposite to be true. The C-suite executives I've worked alongside, they are voracious readers, they ask really hard questions, and they want to know how you did it, not just that you did it. So let me tell you a quick story. So I was once presenting a pretty complex cost savings initiative to the C-suite at Temple University Health System. And one of the executives, he pushed back on me. He said, "Why would we hire you? We have an internal team." And the CFO, he turns to his colleague and he asks him, "How many times have you run this particular initiative?" And the colleague says, "Once." And then the CFO, he turns to me and he asks me the same question. And I told him, "We've done this 40 or 50 times." And he just says, "Well, there you go." So C-suite executives, they are constantly evaluating whether, you've earned the right to be trusted with a decision that matters. And the way you earn that trust, it's through a narrative, like a specific detailed account of what you've done, how you've done it, and what it actually produced for other organizations. And this isn't a case study, right? It's not a bullet point summary. A narrative is what lets them, see their own company in the work and feel confident that you actually understand the terrain. So details are not the problem. The wrong details are the problem. And, every single time I've shared a narrative and an executive has said, "Tell me about the process, I've known we were going to get the deal." Because that question, that's a signal. It means they're evaluating whether they're going to be your first experiment or, your 40th. So step 3 is to consider every lens in the room. Because in healthcare, you almost never talk to just one kind of decision maker, right? Healthcare organizations are uniquely complex. The financial and the clinical and the operational priorities inside a health system, they don't always line up. In fact, a lot of the time they're in real tension. And that tension, it's sitting in the room with you whether you acknowledge it or not. I mean, I've been in so many meetings where the conversation started as a financial discussion and then it shifted to operations and then it ended with the clinicians challenging everything I just said. So you want to be ready for all of it. And here's a simple way to think about the 4 main C-suite perspectives. So the CEO, they're thinking about the big picture and the long-term future of the organization. They care about strategic vision, competitive positioning, and sustainable growth, but also protecting the mission and the reputation of the health system. So you want to connect what you're proposing to where they're taking the organization, 3 to 5 years out. And the CFO, they're thinking about margin. They care about profitability by service line and about ROI, like what this costs and what it returns. And here's something most vendors don't realize. Healthcare CFOs actually have a really hard time calculating true profitability by service line, because the data systems don't always talk to each other. So if you can make that picture clear for them, you'll have their attention. And the CMO and the clinical leaders are thinking about patients. They need to know that whatever you're proposing, it isn't going to compromise care. And I've always been really direct about this. I tell them, I will never change how your organization treats patients, and that's a commitment. And it usually, it opens the door to a real conversation about where you can make financial and operational improvements without ever touching clinical quality. And then the COO, they're thinking about workflow. They care about the team. They feel the operational burden of adding, one more thing to a system that's already running at capacity. So they want to know that your solution is going to make things easier, not harder for the people doing the work every day. So your job, it isn't to have 4 different presentations for 4 different executives. Your job is to have a single clear point of view and enough fluency across all of those lenses to make every person in that room feel seen. Now, step 4 is to build a compelling narrative, and really to build it before the meeting. Because the most common mistake I see, is salespeople treating the C-suite meeting as the place where they go to gather context. Like they walk in with a bunch of questions, hoping the conversation is going to reveal what they need to know. And that's completely backward. The executive isn't there to orient you to their world, right? They're there to evaluate whether you already understand it. So that means doing the work ahead of time. Like, what are the external pressures shaping this health system right now? Regulatory changes, CMS mandates, the competitive dynamics in their market. And what does their financial picture actually look like? And are there gaps that their own data systems might not be surfacing? And what have other health systems in similar situations done? And what did it produce for them? You want to walk in with the answers to those questions. So forget the slides, forget the product features, come in with a clear, specific narrative of what you've seen and what you know and what you believe is possible for their organization. And I learned how powerful this is, from the other side of the table. So at VIE Healthcare, we spent years doing the kind of deep, deep preparation that most vendors just never attempt. Like before we ever walked into a CFO meeting, we had pulled together a complete picture from their clinical and financial and operational data. And we synthesized all of it into, one coherent presentation that showed the executive where the opportunity was and why nobody else had surfaced it yet. And I remember one CFO, he just looked at it and said, I've never seen anything like this. And that's not a compliment to our presentation skills, right? That's a signal that we'd gotten the right details. Because that CFO, he had no idea his visibility stopped at the aggregated level. He assumed his systems told him everything he needed to know. He didn't know what he couldn't see, but we did. And when we brought that same picture to the clinicians, they couldn't deny the data. Finally, step 5, and this is the one that I think most sales teams completely miss. You have to circulate what I call a core authority asset to carry your narrative. Because here's the truth. Most deals fall apart after the C-suite meeting, and it usually goes like this. You finally get in the room, the conversation goes great, the executive's engaged, they're asking questions, they're leaning in, and you leave feeling like the deal is really moving. And then you wait, and the momentum, it just disappears. So what happened? Well, a lot of the time what happened is that the executive shared your 30-page deck with the rest of the organization, but without you there to carry the context, the narrative got lost. Like somebody asked a question that nobody in the room could answer. A competing priority came up, and that urgency that was so alive when you were in the room, it just, it didn't survive the retelling. And that's an asset problem. So after the meeting, you want to leave the C-suite with an asset that travels. And a core authority asset, it's a concise, credible document that communicates your narrative without you. It explains the problem you solve and why it matters to this organization specifically and what a path forward actually looks like. And it's designed to be read when you're not in the room so that any executive, investor, or board member who picks it up can, immediately understand your thinking. And the discipline here is specificity. Because a circulate ready asset that could apply to any health system, it's not going to move any specific health system, right? It has to be built with that particular company's data, with their pressures and their language. And yes, that level of specificity, it's what makes it tough to create, which is exactly why most sales organizations just default to a generic deck. But a core authority asset, it gives your champion inside the organization something they can hand to a colleague and just say, read this instead of, let me set up another meeting so our vendor can come explain it again. So you give them that asset. And you know what? You sell in every single room you can't be in. So let me kind of bring this all together. I started this whole conversation last week frustrated that the consensus selling myth had become a strategy. Like that an entire industry looked at research about selling to the middle of the organization and somehow concluded that the answer was to get better at selling to the middle. And that frustration, honestly, it hasn't really gone away, but it's been replaced by, a really clear picture of what's possible when you stop chasing consensus and you start building context. Because CEOs and CFOs, they are more involved in major buying decisions than ever before. And the executives who seem impossible to reach, they're not impossible. They're just being approached, the wrong way at the wrong level and with the wrong preparation. And the deals that feel stalled, they're not lost. They're just waiting for someone to show up at the right level with the right conversation. And that is a massive opportunity because in healthcare, where the deals are large and the relationships are long and the organizations are complex, the ability to sell with context at the C-suite level, it's one of the biggest competitive advantages available to you right now. And most of your competitors, they're still working the middle. They're still building committees. They're still, waiting for a consensus that's honestly never going to come, but you don't have to wait with them. Now, context selling, is not an easy shortcut. Building the narrative takes real work. Creating a core authority asset takes discipline. And learning to speak across the clinical, financial, and operational lenses in a single conversation that takes, preparation and practice. And this work has always been incredibly labor intensive. Like at VIE, we did it all manually for years. But that's actually changing, thanks to AI. And AI agents are starting to do tasks in minutes that used to take us weeks. Now, they're not replacing the judgment or the relationships or the point of view that a skilled salesperson brings, right? But they dramatically accelerate the context building that makes the difference between, an average meeting and an exceptional one. And that's a longer conversation. It's really the subject of a whole other episode. But I wanted to name it here because I think context selling and AI, they're going to be inseparable before long. So the companies that invest in context, the narrative, the assets, the preparation, they're closing deals faster than the ones waiting for consensus. Because what works isn't building a bigger coalition. What works is giving the executives who already have the authority, the clarity, and the context to use it. So if your sales team is still trying to win deals by building the biggest possible coalition, I think you're leaving the most important conversation off the table. So if you're, thinking about bringing context selling into your revenue strategy, you can find a link in the show notes to start a conversation with me. Plus, I've got some free resources there as well. That's it for this episode of Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller, and I'll be back next week with more strategies to help you sell smarter and stand out. Until next time.